carriage wheels stopped turning at midnight, and Alden Whitmore stepped down into the cold with a stolen name pressed against his chest like a weapon. He was not supposed to be here, not like this. Not dressed in a borrowed coat 2 sizes too large, with dirt rubbed into his boots and a false letter of reference folded inside his sleeve. 3 years had passed since he left his own front gates as a duke, and tonight he was returning as a stranger. A footman named Tom, freshly hired, utterly unknown, walking straight into the heart of everything he owned without a single soul recognizing his face. He had heard the whispers before he ever crossed the border back into England. Whispers that his fortune had drowned somewhere in a foreign port. Whispers that his family was already dividing the silver. Whispers that the woman he had promised to marry was counting the days until she could marry someone richer instead. Rumors traveled faster than ships, and by the time Alden reached his own coastline, half the country believed him ruined, and the other half believed him dead. He did not correct them, not yet. The truth was far more dangerous than either story. His fortune was intact, hidden safely across 3 accounts that no clerk in his household had ever touched. But something else had gone missing while he was away, something he could not buy back with gold, loyalty, or the appearance of it. He needed to know before he ever announced his return, who around him actually cared for the man, and who only cared for the title stitched across his name. So he had done something no duke in living memory had dared to do. He wrote to Barnaby Finch, his oldest steward, the one man who had served the Whitmore family since before Alden was born, and asked him to keep a secret that could unravel everything if it slipped. Barnaby had read the letter twice by candlelight, his hands trembling before he finally agreed. Now, standing in the shadow of the servants' entrance, Alden watched the letter's promise become real. A single lamp flickered above the doorway. Somewhere inside, laughter drifted through a cracked window, careless and warm, completely unaware that the master of the house stood just beyond the glass, disguised as nothing at all. Barnaby met him at the door with a face carved from stone, giving nothing away even as his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "You understand," the old steward whispered, "that if anyone discovers this I cannot protect you, not from your own family." "That is exactly why I am doing it," Alden answered quietly. "I do not want protection, I want the truth." The kitchen swallowed him whole within minutes. He was handed an apron before he could even set down his bag, told to carry firewood, ordered to polish silver he himself had commissioned from a craftsman in London 2 winters ago. No one looked at him twice. No one wondered why a new footman's hands were too smooth for someone who claimed years of labor, or why his accent slipped just once into something far too refined for a servant's tongue. They were too busy, too tired, too consumed by their own worries to notice a duke standing among them, invisible in plain sight. It was almost too easy. That unsettled him more than anything. He had expected suspicion. He had expected questions. Instead, he found a household running on fear and gossip, every servant glancing over their shoulder as though the walls themselves might report their words to someone with power. And that was when he understood how deep the rot might run. If people were this frightened here, in a house that was supposed to be his family's safest place, then something had already changed while he was gone, something worse than money slipping away. He was given a narrow room above the stables, barely large enough for a cot and a chair, and told his duties would begin at dawn. Alden lay awake most of that first night listening to the sounds of his own house from the outside, sounds he had never heard before because a duke never sleeps where the servants sleep, footsteps in the hall above, a door closing too quickly, a voice low and urgent that he almost recognized before it faded into silence. By morning, the household came alive in a way that startled him, not with warmth but with anxiety. Servants moved faster than necessary, spoke less than usual, and cast worried glances toward the main hall where his family had gathered for a private meeting that no one below stairs was permitted to overhear. Alden carried a tray of tea toward that very room, his heartbeat steady despite the risk, and paused just outside the door long enough to catch fragments of a conversation that made his blood run cold. "If the Duke does not return within the month," a voice said, smooth and calculating, "the estate falls to the nearest male relation. That would be me. Edmund Carow, his cousin." The voice was unmistakable, dripping with a patience that sounded almost rehearsed, as though he had practiced this exact sentence in front of a mirror more than once. Another voice answered, softer, more hesitant. "And if he does return, what then, Edmund? What if he comes back with nothing at all, ruined as they say, and expects us to simply welcome him with open arms?" Then Edmund said, We will decide how welcoming to be." Alden stood frozen in the corridor, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. He forced his breathing steady and stepped forward at the exact moment the door opened, nearly walking directly into his cousin's chest. Edmund barely glanced at him, waving him off with the careless dismissal reserved for furniture rather than people, and continued speaking to whoever walked beside him without a single pause. That was the moment Alden understood something important. To his own family, he had already become invisible twice over. Once by choosing this disguise, and once long before that, by simply being away too long. Absence had made him a rumor instead of a man, and rumors, he was learning quickly, could be shaped by whoever spoke loudest in a room he no longer controlled. He delivered the tea, he bowed his head the way a footman should, and inside something sharpened into resolve. If Edmund believed the dukedom was already halfway into his hands, he would need to be watched closely. But Edmund was not the only person Alden had come home to test. There was someone else arriving that very week, someone whose feelings mattered to him far more than any inheritance ever could. Lady Vivienne Carlyle. The woman he had promised to marry before he ever left English soil. The woman whose letters had grown thinner and less frequent with every passing month abroad, until eventually they stopped arriving altogether, replaced only by silence he told himself was simply distance, simply distraction, simply nothing to worry over. He was no longer certain that was true. Word had already reached the kitchen staff that Lady Vivienne's carriage would arrive within days, and the entire household buzzed with preparation. Fresh linens, polished silver, a guest list assembled with the kind of care usually reserved for royalty. Alden listened to it all while scrubbing a hallway floor on his knees, an act so far beneath his station that a year ago he would have laughed at the very suggestion. Tonight, it felt like the only honest thing he had done in months. He wanted to see her face when she believed he might return with nothing. He wanted to know, without a single doubt clouding the answer, whether the woman who once whispered promises against his shoulder loved the man or loved the name attached to him. It was a cruel test, perhaps. He turned the thought over more than once and could not fully disagree with himself. But cruelty measured in a single evening seemed a smaller wound than discovering the truth after a wedding, after vows, after it was far too late to walk away. As the days passed, Alden settled deeper into his disguise, learning the rhythms of a life he had never truly seen from this angle. He learned which servants worked themselves to exhaustion without complaint, and which ones vanished the moment supervision looked away. He learned that the kitchen ran almost entirely on the effort of a young maid who moved through the chaos with a calm he found himself watching more than he intended to. He did not yet know her name. He only knew that when a jug slipped from another servant's tired hands and shattered across the stone floor, she was the first to kneel down and help clean it, murmuring something reassuring instead of scolding, while everyone else stood frozen in fear of punishment that never came from her. Alden filed the moment away without quite understanding why it mattered so much. That night, alone in his narrow room above the stables, he wrote nothing down, kept no letters, left no evidence of who he truly was. He simply lay in the dark and listened to his own house breathing around him, full of secrets he was only just beginning to uncover, and understood with quiet certainty that the coming days would ask more of him than any battlefield or foreign port ever had. Somewhere above him, his cousin was already counting inheritance that did not yet belong to him. Somewhere beyond the estate gates, a carriage was already rolling closer, carrying a woman whose heart he could no longer fully trust. And somewhere within his own kitchen, a maid he had not yet spoken to was quietly becoming the only person in the entire household who made him feel, for the first time since his return, that perhaps not everything at home had changed for the worse. Dawn would bring Lady Vivienne's arrival. Dawn would bring the true beginning of his test. Alden closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years felt something close to fear. Lady Vivienne Carlyle arrived exactly as the household had promised, in a carriage trimmed with silver fittings that caught the morning light like a blade. Alden watched from the stable yard as Footman rushed to lower the steps, and he felt something strange twist in his chest when she finally emerged. She looked the same. Golden hair pinned in careful curls, a traveling gown chosen with obvious precision, a smile already prepared before she had even greeted a single soul. 3 years should have changed something about her. Instead, she looked exactly as she had the day he left, as though time itself had been too polite to touch her. He was assigned to carry her trunks, a task that placed him close enough to hear every word she spoke without ever being seen as anything more than furniture with legs. It was a strange kind of power, invisibility. He had spent his entire life being watched, measured, judged for every gesture and every word, and now, for the first time, he could simply listen. "The house looks smaller than I remember," Vivienne said to her traveling companion, a cousin named Rosalind who had come along for the visit. "I do hope the Duke has not let everything fall into disrepair while he was away chasing whatever foolish venture consumed him." "You have heard nothing more from him directly?" Rosalind asked. "Nothing worth repeating, only rumors same as everyone else. Some say he lost his entire fortune, others say he is simply hiding from his debts." Vivienne's voice carried no worry, only mild irritation, the tone of someone discussing whether rather than the man she had promised to marry. "If it is true, I confess I do not know what I shall do. A title without money is hardly worth the trouble of a wedding." Alden's arms tightened around the trunk he carried, though his face remained perfectly still. He had expected disappointment. He had not expected her to say it so plainly, so easily, as though his worth had always been measured in coin rather than character. "Surely you love him," Rosalind said, almost teasing. "Of course I love him," Vivienne answered, waving a gloved hand. "I have always loved him." "But love does not purchase gowns, Rosalind, nor does it maintain a household of this size. A woman must be practical." He carried the trunk inside without another word, set it down exactly where he was instructed, and walked away before his expression could betray him. Practical, that was the word she had chosen, not devoted, not faithful. Practical, as though he were an investment whose returns had grown uncertain. The days that followed unfolded with a slow, deliberate cruelty that Alden had not fully anticipated when he first devised his plan. Word spread through the household, carefully guided by Barnaby at Alden's own instruction, that the Duke's finances were far worse than rumor had originally suggested. Some said the estate itself might be sold. Others whispered that the family would be forced to dismiss half the staff before winter arrived. It was not entirely true, but it was close enough to the story already circulating outside these walls that no one questioned it, and Alden watched with a mixture of fascination and dread as the news rippled through every room he entered. Edmund Caro received the news with barely concealed delight. Alden watched his cousin's demeanor shift almost overnight, growing bolder with the staff, issuing instructions as though he already held authority over the estate, correcting servants for mistakes that were none of his concern to correct. He began speaking with the family's solicitor in hushed conversations behind closed doors, and though Alden could not always hear the details, he caught enough fragments to understand that Edmund was already preparing paperwork, already positioning himself to claim what he believed would soon be his. Lady Vivienne's response was quieter but no less telling. Her letters, which Alden intercepted through Barnaby with a guilt he could not fully suppress, revealed a woman already calculating her alternatives. She wrote to her mother in London, describing a certain viscount she had recently met at a gathering, a man of considerable fortune and, as she put it, considerably more reliable prospects. She did not mention love in those letters. She mentioned settlements, properties, and the security a wise marriage could provide a woman of her standing. Alden read those words by candlelight in his narrow room above the stables, feeling something inside him settle into a cold, quiet certainty. He had come home hoping to find that his fears were unfounded. Instead, every day confirmed them a little further. It was during this stretch of difficult evenings that he found himself drawn, again and again, toward the kitchen. He told himself it was simply because the kitchen was warm, because the other servants were kinder there than in the rigid formality of the upper household, because the smell of fresh bread reminded him of something he could not quite name. But the truth, which he admitted to himself slowly and reluctantly, was that he kept finding reasons to be near Marian Ashcroft. She was the maid he had noticed on his very first night, the one who knelt to clean broken glass while everyone else stood frozen in fear. He learned her name a few days later, spoken by the cook in a tone of genuine affection rather than mere instruction, and once he knew it, he found himself listening for it constantly, the way one listens for a familiar song in a crowded room. Marian was not beautiful in the practiced, curated way Lady Vivienne was beautiful. Her hands were rough from work, her hair often escaping its pins by mid-afternoon, her apron stained from whatever task had consumed her morning. But there was something in the way she moved through the kitchen, steady and unhurried even during the busiest hours, that Alden found himself watching more closely than he probably should have. One evening, as the rest of the staff finished their meal and drifted toward their quarters, Alden lingered near the hearth, ostensibly tending the fire though it needed no attention at all. Marian remained behind as well, scrubbing the last of the pots with quiet focus, humming something under her breath that he did not recognize. "You are new," she said without looking up, startling him slightly. "Tom, is it not?" "It is," he answered, grateful his false name came easily to his tongue after days of practice. "You watch everything very closely for someone who has only just arrived," Marian said, finally glancing toward him with an expression that held more curiosity than suspicion. "Most new footmen keep their heads down and their mouths shut until they understand who holds power in a house like this." "Perhaps I am simply cautious," Alden said carefully. "Perhaps," she agreed, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe him. She returned to her scrubbing, and for a while silence settled comfortably between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of pottery. "Do you believe the rumors?" Alden asked eventually, unable to resist the question about the Duke. "About his fortune being gone?" Marian set down the pot she was cleaning and considered the question with unexpected seriousness. "I do not know if it is true, but if it is, I hope he is well wherever he has gone. It cannot be easy, losing everything you built your whole life around." "You worry for a man you have never met," Alden said, watching her closely. "I worry for anyone who suffers," she answered simply. "Whether he wears a title or carries firewood makes no difference to me. A man losing his fortune is still a man losing something that mattered to him." "And if he returned," Alden pressed, his voice quieter now, "with nothing at all, no title worth keeping, no money to speak of, would that change how the household should treat him?" Marian looked at him then, truly looked at him in a way that made him feel for one unsettling moment, as though she could see straight through the borrowed coat and false name entirely. "It should not change anything at all," she said. "A person's worth was never something that lived inside their purse, Tom. If it did, the world would be a far crueler place than it already is." Alden did not trust himself to answer immediately. He busied himself with the fire instead, giving his expression time to settle into something calmer than what he actually felt. When he finally spoke again, his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Not everyone shares your view." "No," Marian agreed, gathering her things to leave for the night. "Not everyone does, but I have found that the people who chase fortune above character rarely end up happy, no matter how much they collect along the way." She paused at the doorway, glancing back at him with a small, tired smile. "Good night, Tom." "Good night," he managed to say. Long after she had gone, Alden remained by the dying fire, turning her words over in his mind again and again. He thought of Vivienne's careful calculations, her letters full of settlements and viscounts and practical considerations. He thought of Edmund's barely concealed hunger for an inheritance that was not yet his to claim. And he thought of Marian, a maid with rough hands and an honest heart, who worried for a stranger's suffering without ever knowing that strangers slept only a few rooms away from her every single night. The contrast unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Over the following days, Alden found reasons again and again to remain near the kitchen longer than his duties strictly required. He carried extra firewood that was not needed. He offered to help with tasks well below his supposed station, earning odd looks from the other footmen but never once from Marian, who seemed to accept his presence with the same steady calm she brought to everything else. They spoke often during those quiet evening hours after the rest of the household had retired, conversations that started as simple pleasantries and slowly deepened into something Alden had not expected to find inside his own kitchen. She told him about her family, a modest household in the countryside where her father worked as a carpenter, and her mother kept a small garden that fed half the village during difficult seasons. She spoke of her dream, modest and unpretentious, of one day having a small cottage of her own, nothing grand, just a quiet home where she could grow her own vegetables and perhaps keep a few chickens, free from the constant demands of service to someone else's household. "That sounds like a peaceful life," Alden said one evening, meaning it more sincerely than she likely understood. "It sounds like enough," Marian corrected gently. "I have never needed grand things, Tom. I have only ever wanted enough. A roof that does not leak, food on the table, people around me who are honest even when honesty is difficult." She glanced at him, a teasing note entering her voice. "You, for instance, are dreadfully bad at hiding when something troubles you. Your whole face changes the moment a thought crosses your mind you would rather keep private." Alden laughed despite himself, a genuine sound he had not allowed himself in longer than he could remember. "Is that so?" "It is," she confirmed. "Whatever it is you are hiding, Tom, I hope it resolves itself soon. You carry it like a stone in your pocket, and stones like that only grow heavier the longer a person keeps them hidden." He wanted, more than anything in that moment, to tell her everything. The truth pressed against his throat, urgent and insistent, and it took every ounce of discipline he possessed to swallow it back down. Not yet, he told himself. Not until he understood the full shape of what he had come home to find. But something had shifted inside him during those quiet evenings by the kitchen fire, something he could not have predicted when he first stepped down from his carriage in a borrowed coat. He had come home searching for the truth about loyalty and love among the people closest to his title. He had not expected to find it, unguarded and entirely genuine, in a kitchen maid who had no idea the stranger she spoke so freely with was the very Duke she worried so gently over. As the days moved closer to the dinner that would determine everything, Alden found himself facing a question he had not anticipated when this entire plan began. It was no longer simply about discovering who deserved his trust. It was becoming, with each quiet evening that passed, a question of what he was willing to risk for a truth he had not expected to feel so deeply. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon, carried by a messenger who refused to state his business to anyone but Edmund Carrow directly. Alden watched the exchange from across the courtyard, pretending to sweep a path that did not need sweeping, and noted the way his cousin's expression shifted from polite curiosity to barely restrained excitement the moment he broke the seal. Edmund read the letter twice, folded it with careful precision, and disappeared into the study without a word to anyone. Barnaby found Alden an hour later, his weathered face drawn tight with concern. "The solicitor has drafted papers," the old steward whispered, glancing over his shoulder before continuing. "Papers that would transfer authority over the estate to Master Edmund should the Duke fail to return and formally reclaim his title within a set period of time. I saw the documents myself, delivered this very afternoon." "How long a period?" Alden asked, keeping his voice low and even despite the tightening in his chest. 30 days, Barnaby answered. "Edmund has already begun counting them." 30 days. Alden turned the number over in his mind as he walked the length of the eastern corridor that evening, carrying a tray of correspondence he had no genuine reason to carry, except that it gave him an excuse to move freely through parts of the house normally closed to servants of his supposed rank. He understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and heavy in his stomach, that his cousin was not simply hoping for the estate to fall into his hands through circumstance. Edmund was actively working to ensure it happened, regardless of whether the rumors about lost fortune held any truth at all. That realization changed the shape of everything. This was no longer merely a test of loyalty conducted for his own curiosity. It had become something far more dangerous, a genuine attempt by his own blood relation to seize control of everything Alden's family had built across generations. If he waited too long to reveal himself, if he allowed his disguise to continue past whatever quiet timeline Edmund had established with the solicitor, he risked losing far more than the answers he had originally sought. And yet he could not bring himself to end it, not yet. Not while so much remained unresolved, not while Marian's honest warmth continued drawing him back to the kitchen fire each evening, not while Vivienne's true intentions remained only half revealed through intercepted letters rather than witnessed directly with his own eyes. He decided that night that he would allow himself 2 more weeks, enough time to gather undeniable proof of Edmund's scheme, enough time to see clearly whether Vivienne's calculating words in private letters matched her behavior when she believed no one of consequence was watching, and enough time, though he barely admitted this even to himself, to understand exactly what he felt when he thought of Marian Ashcroft and her rough, capable hands and her unwavering honesty. The following days brought a shift in the household's rhythm that Alden had not anticipated. Lady Vivienne, growing bored with the quiet routines of a country estate she believed might soon change hands, announced she would host a small gathering of her own, inviting several neighboring families for an evening of cards and conversation. Among the guests, arriving with far too much enthusiasm for a supposedly casual visit, was Viscount Pelham, the very man Vivienne had described so favorably in her letters to her mother. Alden served drinks that evening, moving silently between guests who spoke of him as though he were not present at all, a skill he was becoming uncomfortably practiced at. He watched Vivienne throughout the gathering, watched the way her laughter grew brighter whenever the Viscount spoke, the way she leaned slightly closer to him during conversation, the way her fingers lingered a moment too long when she accepted a glass from his hand. It was subtle, careful, the kind of behavior that could be explained away as simple politeness to anyone not specifically watching for signs of betrayal. But Alden was watching for exactly that, and what he saw confirmed every fear her letters had already planted in his mind. "Tell me, Lady Vivienne," the Viscount said at one point, his voice carrying easily across the room during a lull in the card game, "what will become of your engagement should the rumors about the Duke's misfortune prove accurate?" A ripple of uncomfortable silence passed through the gathered guests, though Vivienne herself did not seem particularly troubled by the bluntness of the question. "I suppose," she answered, tapping her cards thoughtfully against the table, "that would depend entirely on how severe the misfortune turns out to be. A woman must think practically about her future, Viscount. Sentiment alone has never kept a household running." "A wise philosophy," the Viscount replied, and something in his tone suggested this was not the first time the two of them had discussed the subject privately. Alden withdrew from the room shortly after, unable to remain in the same space without risking his composure entirely. He walked the grounds alone for nearly an hour beneath a sky heavy with clouds, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger and something closer to grief. He had known intellectually that this test might reveal exactly what he was now witnessing. Knowing it in theory and watching it unfold in practice, however, proved to be an entirely different kind of pain. He found himself eventually standing outside the kitchen door, drawn there without quite deciding to walk in that direction. The gathering upstairs continued without him, laughter and music drifting faintly through the walls, but the kitchen itself stood quiet, most of the staff having retired for the night after the evening's preparations. Only a single candle burned near the hearth, and beside it sat Marian, mending a tear in one of the serving cloths with slow, careful stitches. "You look troubled," she said without looking up, as though she had expected him to appear. "It has been a difficult evening," Alden admitted, settling into the chair across from her, too exhausted to maintain his usual careful reserve. "The gathering upstairs?" Marian asked, setting down her needle briefly. "I heard some of the guests through the serving door earlier. Lady Vivienne seemed rather taken with her Viscount friend from what little I overheard." Alden said nothing, but his silence apparently answered enough of the question for Marian to understand. "It is not my place to comment on the affairs of those above stairs," she continued carefully, "but I confess it troubles me, watching a woman speak so openly of choosing a husband based on his fortune rather than his character. I do not know Lady Vivienne well, nor the Duke she is meant to marry, but it seems a poor foundation for a lifetime together." "And what would you consider a good foundation?" Alden asked, genuinely curious despite the ache still sitting heavy in his chest. Marian considered the question seriously, resuming her stitching as she thought. "Trust, I suppose, knowing that the person beside you would remain beside you even if everything else fell away. Fortune can vanish overnight, Tom, fields flood, markets collapse, even the grandest houses sometimes burn to the ground. If love depends entirely on wealth remaining constant, it was never truly love to begin with. It was simply an arrangement wearing love's clothing." Her words settled into him like something solid and true, a foundation he had not realized he was searching for until she offered it so freely, without any awareness of how directly it applied to the very situation unfolding above their heads that very night. "You speak as though you have thought about this a great deal," Alden observed. "I have watched my parents love each other through very lean years," Marian said, a small, fond smile touching her lips. "There were winters we had barely enough to eat, when my father's work grew scarce and my mother's garden failed to yield much of anything. And still, I never once doubted that they loved each other completely, because their affection never seemed to depend on circumstance. It simply was, regardless of what the world around them decided to take away." She glanced up at him then, her expression softening. "I suppose that is the kind of love I hope to find someday, Tom, if I am fortunate enough. Not something that bends with every change in fortune, but something steady enough to hold through whatever comes." Alden found himself unable to speak for a long moment, caught between the ache of what he had witnessed upstairs and the quiet wonder of what sat directly across from him now. He had spent 3 years abroad, surrounded by merchants and diplomats who measured every relationship in terms of advantage and profit, and he had nearly forgotten that a heart like Marian's could exist so simply, so unguarded, in the middle of a household otherwise consumed by calculation. "I hope you find it," he said finally, meaning it with an intensity that surprised even himself. "Perhaps I already have in small ways," Marion said, returning her attention to her stitching, though a faint color had risen in her cheeks that she seemed determined to ignore. "Good friends, honest work, a roof over my head even if it is not my own. It is not everything, but it is enough for now." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the candle burning lower between them, until the sounds of the gathering upstairs finally began to fade as guests took their leave for the evening. Alden knew he should return to his duties, should be present to assist with the departing carriages, but he found himself reluctant to end this quiet moment, reluctant to return to a world where every conversation felt weighted with calculation and hidden motive. Eventually, duty won out over reluctance, and he rose to leave, pausing at the doorway to glance back at Marion one final time. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night, Tom," she replied, and then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Whatever it is that troubles you, I hope it resolves itself soon. You deserve peace, even if you are too stubborn to admit you are searching for it." He carried those words with him long after he left the kitchen, turning them over as he assisted departing guests into their carriages beneath the cold night sky. He watched Vivienne bid the Viscount farewell with a warmth that lingered a moment too long to be purely social courtesy, watched Edmund observe the entire exchange with a calculating expression that suggested he too understood exactly what was unfolding between them, and understood that the threads of this test were drawing tighter with every passing day. 2 weeks, he had told himself. 2 weeks to gather what remained of the truth before he could no longer afford to wait. But as he lay awake that night in his narrow room above the stables, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling from a single dying candle, Alden realized the timeline mattered less than he had originally believed. He already knew, in the quiet, honest part of himself, he had spent years learning to ignore in favor of duty and obligation, exactly what he had discovered during these weeks of disguise. He knew that Vivienne's love, if it could even be called that, depended entirely on circumstances remaining favorable, a love that would dissolve the moment his fortune proved uncertain, regardless of whatever affection she might have once genuinely felt for him. He knew that Edmund's ambition ran deeper and colder than mere opportunism, a calculated scheme built on the assumption that his cousin might never return at all, or might return too broken to reclaim what belonged to him. And he knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure, that somewhere in his own kitchen, unaware of the borrowed name and hidden title separating them, a maid with rough hands and an honest heart had already offered him something far more valuable than anything his fortune could ever purchase. The question remaining was no longer whether he had learned the truth he set out to find. The question remaining was what he intended to do with it, and how much more he was willing to risk before the 30 days Edmund had already begun counting ran out entirely. Sleep did not come easily that night, but when it finally did, Alden's last thoughts were not of solicitors or inheritance papers or calculating letters to distant mothers. They were of a candle burning low over careful stitching, and a voice that spoke of steady love as though it were the simplest thing in the world to find, if only a person knew where to look. Edmund Caro had begun to notice the footman. It started as a passing observation, barely worth mentioning, the kind of small irritation a man like Edmund typically dismissed without a second thought. But irritation, left unattended, has a way of growing into suspicion, and by the second week of his careful counting toward 30 days, Edmund found himself watching the new servant named Tom with an attention that made Alden's skin prickle every time he felt those eyes settle on him from across a room. "There is something strange about that footman," Edmund remarked one afternoon to Vivienne, loud enough that Alden, arranging fresh flowers nearby, could hear every word without appearing to listen. "He carries himself oddly, too straight in the shoulders for a man who has spent his life bowing and fetching." "Perhaps he was a soldier before entering service," Vivienne suggested, barely glancing up from the letter she was writing. "Many footmen come from military backgrounds. It would explain the posture." "Perhaps," Edmund allowed, though his tone carried no conviction. "And yet Barnaby tells me he arrived with references from a household in the north that no one in this county has ever heard mentioned before. Strange, is it not, for a man supposedly well trained in service to appear from nowhere at precisely the moment our own Duke has vanished?" Alden kept his hand steady as he arranged the flowers, though his heart had begun beating faster than he would have liked. He had known this risk existed from the very beginning, had accepted it as an unavoidable price of the disguise he chose to wear, but hearing his cousin voice the exact suspicion he feared most sent a cold thread of alarm through his chest regardless. "You suspect him of something?" Vivienne asked, finally setting down her pen with an expression of mild curiosity rather than genuine concern. "I suspect everyone of something these days," Edmund replied, his eyes flicking briefly toward Alden before returning to Vivienne. 30 days is not so long a time, and a great deal of money remains unaccounted for. A man in that footman's position, moving freely through this household while everyone else is too distracted to notice him closely, could learn a great many useful things if he were clever enough. Alden finished his task and excused himself as quickly as propriety allowed, retreating toward the servants' quarters with his pulse hammering uncomfortably in his throat. He found Barnaby in the pantry and relayed the exchange in a low, urgent voice, watching the old steward's face grow increasingly troubled as he listened. "He has always been the suspicious sort," Barnaby said finally, though his reassurance sounded thinner than usual. "But if Master Edmund begins asking questions about your references directly, requesting letters or verification from the household you claimed to serve previously, we will have very little to offer him beyond what I fabricated hastily on your behalf. It will not withstand serious scrutiny, Your Grace." "Then we must ensure he has no reason to scrutinize it seriously," Alden said, though even as he spoke the words, he understood how thin that hope truly was. He redoubled his efforts to remain unremarkable after that conversation, taking care to slouch slightly when he walked, to fumble occasionally with tasks he could otherwise perform with practiced ease, to avoid any situation that might place him too near Edmund's watchful gaze for longer than necessary. It was exhausting, this constant performance layered atop an already difficult deception, and he found himself, more than ever, seeking refuge in the one place within the entire household where he did not feel the need to perform at all. Marian noticed his heightened tension almost immediately. "You have grown quieter these past few days," she observed one evening, watching him from across the kitchen table as she kneaded dough for the following morning's bread. "And you flinch now whenever someone calls your name unexpectedly. What has happened?" "Nothing worth troubling you with," Alden said, though the deflection came out weaker than he intended. "I did not ask because I was troubled," Marian replied, not unkindly. "I asked because I have grown accustomed to your company these past weeks, Tom, and I find I do not much care for watching you carry whatever burden has settled over you without at least offering to listen." She paused her kneading, wiping flour from her hands, and studied him with an openness that made it difficult to maintain the careful walls he had built around himself. "You need not tell me everything. But you need not pretend nothing is wrong either, not with me." Alden considered, for one dangerous moment, telling her the truth. The temptation pressed against him with a force that startled him, an urgent need to simply lay down the disguise entirely and speak honestly with the one person in this entire household who had shown him nothing but genuine kindness since his return. But he thought of Edmund's suspicious gaze, of the 30 days still counting down toward whatever legal maneuvering his cousin intended, and understood that revealing himself now, before he had gathered sufficient proof and secured his position, could unravel everything before he was prepared to act. "There are matters above stairs that concern me," he said instead, choosing his words carefully to remain truthful without revealing too much. "Matters involving the family's future that I fear may not resolve favorably for everyone involved." "You speak as though you carry some personal stake in how the Duke's family fares," Marian said, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. There was something sharp in her gaze then, something that made Alden's breath catch, as though she had noticed something in his phrasing that did not quite fit the simple footman he claimed to be. "Perhaps I have simply grown fond of this household," he offered, which was true enough in its own strange way, "and do not wish to see it fall into the wrong hands." Marian held his gaze a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable, and for a heartbeat, Alden feared she had seen straight through him. But then she simply nodded, returning her attention to the bread dough with a small, thoughtful smile. "That is a kinder sentiment than I expected from most footmen who pass through a house like this without much loyalty beyond their wages. Perhaps you are not so ordinary as you pretend to be, Tom." The words landed closer to the truth than she likely realized, and Alden found himself both relieved and unsettled by how easily she seemed to sense the layers hidden beneath his disguise, even without understanding their true shape. Their conversations continued in this manner over the following days, Marian gently probing at the edges of whatever secret he carried without ever pushing hard enough to demand a full accounting, and Alden growing more certain with each passing evening that whatever he felt toward her had moved well beyond simple fondness into something far more dangerous to his careful plans. He found himself thinking of her during the long hours he spent monitoring Edmund's activities, found himself comparing her steady warmth against Vivienne's calculating letters, found himself, more than once, imagining what it might mean to reveal his true identity to her specifically, before anyone else in the household learned the truth. But danger arrived from an unexpected direction before he could act on any of those quiet imaginings. It happened during a formal dinner Vivienne had arranged to celebrate her upcoming visit from her mother, a gathering meant to showcase the household's continued prosperity despite the lingering rumors of the Duke's ruin. Alden served at the table as usual, moving carefully through the practiced choreography of pouring wine and clearing plates, when Vivienne, mid-conversation with a guest, glanced toward him with sudden, startled recognition that made his entire body go cold. "You," she said, setting down her glass and studying him with narrowed eyes. "There is something familiar about you. Have we met before?" The table fell silent, several guests turning their attention toward the exchange with polite curiosity. Alden forced his expression into careful blankness, bowing his head slightly in the manner expected of servants. "I do not believe so, my lady. I am new to this household." "Strange," Vivienne murmured, still studying him with an intensity that made his pulse race dangerously fast. "You remind me of someone, something in your bearing perhaps, or the shape of your jaw." She shook her head slowly, though her eyes did not fully release him. "Forgive me, I am certain it is nothing. Perhaps I simply miss familiar faces during these uncertain times." The dinner continued, but Alden felt Edmund's gaze settle on him with renewed, sharpened suspicion for the remainder of the evening, and he understood with growing certainty that his time to act freely within this disguise was rapidly running out. Whatever answers he still needed to gather, whatever truths remained hidden about the people closest to his title, he would need to secure them quickly, before recognition dawned fully in either Vivienne's calculating eyes or Edmund's watchful, hungry ones. That night he found Marian waiting near the kitchen hearth despite the late hour, her expression troubled in a way he had not seen before. "Lady Vivienne looked at you very strangely at dinner," she said without preamble, "and Master Edmund has been asking the other servants questions about you, about where you came from and what references brought you here. I do not like it, Tom. Something about the way they speak of you feels dangerous." "I know," Alden admitted quietly, the honesty slipping free before he could stop it. Marian studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, softened, deepened into a concern that reached beyond simple curiosity into something Alden recognized, with a jolt, as genuine care. "Whatever trouble follows you, Tom, I hope you know you are not entirely alone in facing it. Whatever you have not told me, I trust that you have your reasons, and I will not press you further than you are willing to share." She reached out then briefly and touched his hand where it rested against the table, a small gesture that carried far more weight than its simplicity suggested. "But please be careful. I find I would be genuinely troubled if something happened to you." Alden looked down at her hand covering his, felt the roughness of her palm against his skin, and understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity that whatever remained of his careful test, whatever proof he still needed to gather about Vivienne and Edmund, and the fragile future of his estate, none of it mattered nearly as much as the quiet warmth of this moment, offered freely by a woman who had no idea the stranger before her carried an entire dukedom hidden beneath his borrowed coat. "I will be careful," he promised, and meant it with an intensity that surprised even himself. But careful, he was quickly learning, might not be enough to hold back the storm that recognition and suspicion were already beginning to gather above his head. The search happened 3 days later, while Alden was occupied delivering messages to a neighboring estate on Barnaby's careful instruction, a task deliberately arranged to draw him away from the property for several hours. He did not learn of it until he returned near dusk, exhausted from the long ride, only to find Barnaby waiting for him near the stables with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Master Edmund searched your room this afternoon," the old steward whispered urgently, pulling Alden into the shadows behind the stable wall before he could be seen by anyone crossing the courtyard. He claimed he suspected theft among the staff and insisted on searching every servant's quarters as a precaution. I could not stop him without raising further suspicion myself. Alden's blood ran cold. What did he find? Nothing that would immediately reveal your identity, thank Providence, Barnaby said, though his relief seemed fragile at best. You were careful enough not to keep anything obviously incriminating in your room, but he found the coat you arrived in, Your Grace, the one beneath your servant's clothing, tailored far too finely for any footman's wardrobe. He said nothing to me directly, but I saw the way he studied the stitching before folding it back exactly as he found it. He suspects something now, even if he cannot yet name what. Alden pressed a hand against the rough wood of the stable wall, steadying himself against the sudden dizziness that threatened to overtake him. The coat. He had kept it hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped carefully to avoid detection, and had believed the hiding place secure enough to withstand casual scrutiny. He had not anticipated Edmund's search reaching that level of thoroughness, had not anticipated his cousin's suspicion growing sharp enough to warrant tearing apart a servant's meager quarters in search of answers. I must leave the estate, Alden said finally, his mind racing through the rapidly narrowing set of options available to him. Tonight, before Edmund has time to act further on his suspicions. I need time to gather proper evidence of his scheme with the solicitor, time that I no longer have if he intends to expose me before I am ready to reveal myself on my own terms. And what of Lady Vivienne? Barnaby asked. What of the young maid you have grown so fond of these past weeks? Will you simply vanish without explanation to either of them? The question struck deeper than Alden expected, and he found himself unable to answer immediately, torn between the urgent necessity of protecting his plan and the aching reluctance to leave Marian without any word at all, especially after the quiet trust that had grown between them these past weeks. I will find a way to explain everything in time, he said eventually, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. But first I must ensure I still have a title and an estate remaining to explain it from. He spent that evening moving carefully through the household, gathering what few belongings he dared take without raising suspicion, and preparing a hasty message for Barnaby to deliver to his solicitor in London, requesting documentation that would prove, beyond any doubt, the fraudulent nature of Edmund's inheritance claim. He planned to slip away before dawn, to travel under cover of darkness toward the nearest town where he could send word ahead and begin assembling the proof he needed to return properly, as himself, with undeniable authority to reclaim what belonged to him. But fate, it seemed, had little patience for careful plans. He was crossing the darkened courtyard toward the stables, his small bundle of belongings tucked beneath his arm, when a voice called out from the shadows near the kitchen entrance, sharp and commanding in a tone Alden recognized immediately. "Going somewhere, Footman." Edmund stepped into the moonlight, his expression carrying none of its usual careless arrogance, replaced instead by a cold, calculating focus that made Alden's stomach twist with dread. Behind him, two of the household's larger servants emerged as well, clearly summoned in advance for exactly this purpose. "I have received word my mother is unwell," Alden said, keeping his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "I must travel to her at once." "How curious," Edmund said, circling slowly closer, "that a man who arrived at this household with references from a place no one has ever heard of should suddenly need to depart in the middle of the night mere days after I discovered a coat in his quarters far too fine for any servant's honest wages." He stopped directly in front of Alden, studying his face with an intensity that made pretense nearly impossible to maintain. "Tell me, Footman, or whatever your true name might be, exactly who you are, and exactly what business you truly have within this household." Alden's mind raced through every possible response, weighing the risk of continuing his deception against the greater risk of revealing himself too soon, without the proof he needed to secure his position beyond any challenge Edmund might attempt to mount. But before he could settle on an answer, a new voice cut through the tense silence, startling everyone present. "Leave him be, Master Edmund." Marian emerged from the kitchen doorway, her expression fierce despite the late hour and the clear danger of interrupting a confrontation between a servant and a member of the household's own family. She crossed the courtyard quickly, positioning herself directly beside Alden with a boldness that stole the breath from his lungs. "This is not your concern, girl," Edmund said, his tone carrying a warning edge that made Marian's chin lift only higher in defiance. "He has done nothing but work honestly since he arrived," Marian said, her voice steady despite the obvious risk she was taking. "Whatever suspicions you carry about his past, you have no proof of any wrongdoing. only a fine coat that could have been given to him by a former employer, or purchased second-hand, or a dozen other explanations that do not require you dragging him before the entire household in the middle of the night like a common thief. "You seem remarkably invested in his defense," Edmund observed, his eyes narrowing between Marian and Alden with growing suspicion. "Perhaps there is more between the two of you than simple kitchen friendship." "Perhaps I simply believe in fairness," Marian shot back, "which is more than I can say for a man who has spent weeks preparing paperwork to claim an inheritance that is not yet his, counting down days as though his own cousin's misfortune were cause for celebration rather than concern." A stunned silence fell across the courtyard. Alden watched Edmund's expression darken dangerously, watched the two servants behind him shift uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene in a confrontation that had suddenly grown far more complicated than a simple interrogation of a suspicious footman. "You overstep considerably, girl," Edmund said, his voice low and dangerous now. "Watch your tongue, or you will find yourself dismissed from this household without reference, regardless of whatever affection you have developed for this stranger." "Dismiss me then," Marian said, though Alden could see the fear beneath her defiant posture, could see how much courage this confrontation demanded of her despite everything she stood to lose. "But you will not drag an innocent man before this household on nothing more than suspicion and a fine coat, not while I have breath to object." Alden knew in that moment that he could not allow her to sacrifice her own position for his sake, could not stand silently by while she risked everything she had built in this household to defend a man whose true identity she did not even know. The weight of that realization settled over him with sudden, overwhelming clarity, and he understood that whatever careful plans he had constructed, whatever timeline he had hoped to follow toward a proper reveal, none of it mattered as much as protecting the woman who had just placed herself between him and danger, without a second thought for her own safety. "Enough," Alden said, stepping forward, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even the servants standing behind Edmund. "She has done nothing wrong. Release her from any blame in this matter entirely." Edmund turned his attention fully toward Alden now, something shifting in his expression as he studied the change in bearing, the sudden confidence that had crept into a voice that moments before had carried the careful deference of a servant. "You give commands rather easily for a man supposedly fleeing to his mother's sickbed," he said slowly, suspicion sharpening into something closer to certain recognition. Alden felt the moment stretching between them, felt the truth pressing against his lips with an urgency he could no longer fully contain, and understood that the careful disguise he had worn these past weeks was crumbling faster than he had ever anticipated, forced open not by Edmund's clever investigation alone, but by his own unwillingness to let Marian suffer in his place. He was not yet ready to reveal everything. He did not yet have the documentation from London that would secure his position beyond challenge, did not yet have undeniable proof of Edmund's scheme with the solicitor. But he understood, standing in that moonlit courtyard with Marian beside him and Edmund's suspicious gaze fixed firmly upon him, that the time for careful waiting had finally, irrevocably run out. Something in the tense silence of that courtyard told him the truth would emerge tonight, one way or another, whether he was fully prepared for it or not. Alden made a swift decision, one that would need to hold only long enough to buy the days he still required. "I am no thief and no impostor seeking to harm this household," he said, meeting Edmund's suspicious gaze directly. "I was sent here quietly, at the request of a party you would not wish named openly in front of the staff, to observe the household's affairs during the Duke's uncertain absence. If you wish to challenge that claim, I would advise discussing it privately, rather than airing accusations before servants who have no place in matters of this delicacy." It was a fragile lie, built from nothing but desperation, yet it carried just enough plausible weight to give Edmund pause. A man investigating on behalf of some distant relation or the family's own solicitors was not so far-fetched a possibility, and the deliberate vagueness of the claim left Edmund unable to immediately disprove it without revealing more of his own scheming than he likely wished to expose before the assembled servants. "Private conversation, then," Edmund said finally, his eyes narrowing with calculation rather than full satisfaction. "Tomorrow, my study after breakfast. And you," he added, turning toward Marian with cold precision, "will remember your place in this household going forward, or you will find yourself without one." He turned and strode back toward the house, the two summoned servants following uncertainly in his wake, leaving Alden and Marian alone in the cooling night air. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the tension of the confrontation still humming between them like a struck bell. "You should not have intervened," Alden said finally, though the words carried more gratitude than reproach. "And you should not have been standing there prepared to let him drag you off without a single word in your own defense," Marian replied, her voice still trembling slightly from the confrontation. "Whoever you truly are, Tom, or whatever name belongs to you, I could not simply stand by and watch." "You risked your position for a man you barely know," Alden said quietly. "I risked my position for a man I have come to know a great deal, actually," Marian corrected, some of her earlier fierceness softening into something gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. "Perhaps not the details of your past, or the reasons you arrived here in such secrecy, but I know how you speak to the other servants with respect rather than condescension. I know how you noticed when old Mrs. Higgins struggled to carry water and quietly took the task from her without ever mentioning it to anyone. I know enough of your character, Tom, even without knowing everything else." Alden looked at her in the moonlight, this remarkable woman who had just staked her livelihood on faith in his character alone, without the slightest knowledge of the title and fortune hidden beneath his borrowed name, and felt something settle within him that had been searching for its place since the very moment he first stepped down from his carriage weeks ago. "Thank you," he said simply, unable to find words adequate to the moment. "Do not thank me yet," Marian said, a tired smile touching her lips despite everything. "We still must survive whatever conversation awaits you in that study tomorrow morning. Whatever explanation you offer him will need to hold considerably more weight than the one you gave tonight." She was right, of course, and Alden spent the remainder of that night not sleeping but planning, drafting in his mind exactly what he would say to Edmund the following morning, how much truth he could safely reveal without collapsing his advantage entirely, and how quickly he could arrange for the documentation from his London solicitor to arrive and settle the matter beyond any further challenge. The conversation the next morning proved tense, but ultimately survivable. Alden maintained his fabricated story of quiet investigation on behalf of an unnamed party, refusing to elaborate further despite Edmund's increasingly pointed questions, and eventually convinced his cousin, through sheer stubborn insistence, that pressing the matter further risked exposing whatever delicate arrangement supposedly stood behind his presence. Edmund remained suspicious, clearly unsatisfied, but agreed, for the moment, to allow the matter to rest, provided Alden remained within the household under closer observation going forward. It was a temporary reprieve, nothing more, and Alden understood that his window for gathering proof and orchestrating a proper reveal had narrowed considerably. He sent an urgent message to his solicitor that very afternoon, requesting the documentation be delivered with all possible haste, and began quietly preparing for what he now understood would need to happen far sooner than his original careful timeline had allowed. It was during this tense, uncertain stretch of days that Lady Vivienne's true nature revealed itself with a clarity that left no room for doubt or reinterpretation. The occasion arrived during a formal luncheon hosted for several visiting families, an event Vivienne had organized with characteristic precision, determined to demonstrate the household's continued prosperity despite the persistent rumors still circulating through county gossip. Alden served at the gathering as usual, moving carefully among the guests, when an unfortunate accident placed him directly in Vivienne's path at the worst possible moment. He had been carrying a tray of delicate china teacups, freshly imported and clearly among Vivienne's most prized possessions, when another servant, hurrying past with an armful of linens, collided with him unexpectedly. The tray tilted, and though Alden managed to prevent most of the cups from falling, one slipped free and shattered against the polished floor directly at Vivienne's feet. The room fell silent. Vivienne stared down at the shattered china, her expression twisting from surprise into sharp, undisguised fury. "You clumsy, worthless creature," she snapped, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly hushed gathering, all pretense of gracious hospitality abandoned entirely in her anger. "Do you have any idea what that cup cost? More than your entire year's wages combined, I would wager, and you have destroyed it without the slightest care." "My apologies, my lady," Alden said, bowing his head, though something cold and sharp had settled in his chest at the venomous contempt in her voice, a tone he had never once heard her direct toward him during the years of their courtship, when he wore his own name and his own title openly. "Apologies do not repair broken china," Vivienne continued, her voice rising further, drawing the attention of every guest in the room. "I do not know where the Duke finds servants these days, hiring men clearly incapable of the simplest tasks, but I shall be recommending your immediate dismissal the moment he returns, assuming he ever does. Households like this one cannot afford to keep clumsy fools on staff, particularly not during times of such uncertain finances." The cruelty in her words, delivered so casually before an audience of guests, struck Alden with a force he had not anticipated, not because the insult itself wounded him deeply, but because of what it revealed so plainly about the woman he had once believed he loved. This was not simply calculated ambition regarding fortune and settlements, the careful practicality she had displayed in her private letters. This was contempt, genuine and unfiltered, directed at a person she believed beneath her notice, revealed the moment circumstance offered even the smallest excuse. He thought in that humiliating moment of Marian kneeling to clean broken glass alongside a frightened servant weeks earlier, offering comfort rather than scorn. The contrast could not have been more complete, nor more damning of the choice he had once nearly made in marrying Vivienne without ever truly testing the depth of her character. "I will have the mess cleaned immediately, my lady," Alden said, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. "See that you do," Vivienne said dismissively, already turning her attention back to her guests as though the exchange had cost her nothing at all, her earlier warmth returning instantly now that the servant responsible for her irritation had been sufficiently chastised. "Now, where were we? Ah yes, the upcoming season in London. I do hope the weather cooperates this year." Alden knelt to gather the broken pieces of china, his hands steady despite everything, and understood with absolute finality that whatever remained of his affection for Vivienne Carlyle had died completely in that moment, replaced by a clear-eyed recognition of exactly who she truly was beneath the careful beauty and practiced charm. He found Marian later that evening, still shaken by the public humiliation despite his best efforts to appear unaffected, and she listened quietly as he described, in careful terms that revealed nothing of his true identity, the cruelty he had witnessed and experienced at the luncheon. "She sounds like a woman who has never once had to consider anyone's feelings but her own," Marian said, her voice gentle despite the obvious anger she felt on his behalf. "I am sorry you experienced that, Tom. No one deserves to be spoken to in such a manner, regardless of their position in a household." "It is strange," Alden admitted, "how quickly a broken teacup can reveal a person's true character, more clearly than months of careful conversation ever could." "Sometimes it takes very little to reveal what has been there all along," Marian agreed. "The moment does not create the cruelty, Tom. It simply removes whatever polite mask had been covering it before." He thought about those words long into the night, understanding now with complete clarity exactly what his elaborate test had ultimately revealed. Vivienne's love, if it had ever truly existed at all, had been built on a foundation of fortune and status rather than genuine affection for the man beneath the title. Edmund's loyalty had been nothing more than patient calculation, waiting for opportunity to reveal his true ambitions. And Marian, a kitchen maid who owned nothing beyond her honest character and steady kindness, had offered him something neither of them had been capable of providing, not for a single moment throughout his entire elaborate test. The documentation from London arrived 3 days later, delivered quietly to Barnaby under cover of routine correspondence, containing everything Alden needed to expose Edmund's fraudulent scheme beyond any possible challenge. With that proof finally secured, and with his patience for continued deception thoroughly exhausted after the cruelty he had witnessed and endured these past difficult weeks, Alden understood that the time for hiding had finally, completely come to an end. He would reveal himself, not quietly, not through careful private conversation, but openly, before the entire household gathered together, in a manner that would leave no doubt about the truth he had uncovered during his weeks disguised as nothing more than a humble footman. The dinner, he decided, would happen within the week. Barnaby arranged the formal dinner within 4 days, announcing to the household that the Duke had finally sent word of his intended return and wished for a proper gathering to be prepared in his honor, bringing together family, staff, and the household's closest connections to mark the occasion. Vivienne threw herself into the preparations with renewed enthusiasm, apparently deciding that whatever fortune the Duke returned with, a grand welcome dinner cost her nothing, and might prove useful regardless of how circumstances ultimately unfolded. Edmund, for his part, grew visibly tense at the announcement, his carefully counted 30 days now threatened by the sudden prospect of his cousin's actual return. Alden spent those 4 days moving between his duties as a footman and quiet, careful preparation for what would come. He reviewed the documentation from his solicitor repeatedly, ensuring every detail of Edmund's fraudulent scheme was thoroughly documented and impossible to dispute. He arranged, through Barnaby, for his own proper clothing to be secretly delivered and hidden nearby, ready for the moment he intended to reveal his true identity. And he found himself, during the quiet evening hours that remained available to him, drawn again and again toward the kitchen, toward Marian, uncertain exactly how he would explain the deception he had maintained throughout their entire acquaintance, yet unwilling to let the remaining days pass without spending whatever time he still could in her honest, steady company. "You seem different these past few days," Marian observed on the evening before the dinner, watching him with the same perceptive attention she always seemed to bring to their conversations. "Calmer, somehow, despite everything that has happened, as though you have finally decided something important." "I have," Alden admitted, unable to offer more detail without revealing everything before he was ready. "Tomorrow, I think, will bring an end to a great many uncertainties that have troubled this household for some time." "That sounds rather ominous," Marian said, though her tone remained gentle rather than alarmed. "Perhaps," Alden allowed, "or perhaps it will simply bring the clarity everyone here has been lacking for far too long." He hesitated, then added, more quietly than he intended, "Whatever happens tomorrow, Marian, I want you to know that these past weeks, spent in your company, have meant more to me than you could possibly understand." Marian studied him for a long moment, something soft and uncertain passing across her expression. "You speak as though you are preparing to say goodbye." "Perhaps I am preparing for something entirely different than goodbye," Alden said, allowing himself the smallest smile despite the nervousness building steadily within him. "But I cannot yet explain further. Tomorrow everything will become clear. I only ask that you remember, whatever you learn about me tomorrow, that everything I have shared with you during these quiet evenings has been entirely honest, regardless of what else I may have concealed." He left her standing by the hearth with those cryptic words hanging in the air between them, uncertain whether he had offered comfort or created new worry, but understanding that whatever confusion his words caused would resolve itself soon enough, when the truth finally emerged before the entire household. The evening of the dinner arrived with a formality the household had not seen in years. Vivienne had spared no effort in the preparations, the dining hall gleaming with polished silver and fresh flowers, the finest china carefully arranged despite the earlier tragedy of the broken teacup. Guests from neighboring estates arrived throughout the afternoon, drawn by curiosity about the Duke's long-awaited return, and the household staff moved through their duties with visible anticipation, uncertain exactly what the evening would bring but sensing correctly that something significant was about to unfold. Alden served at the table as usual through the first several courses, maintaining his careful disguise even as his heart raced with anticipation of what was to come. He watched Vivienne hold court at the head of the table, gracious and radiant in a gown clearly chosen for maximum effect, already speaking as though her position as the Duke's intended bride remained entirely secure despite her private letters to the contrary. He watched Edmund seated nearby, tension visible beneath his practiced composure, his eyes darting occasionally toward the door as though expecting some catastrophe to interrupt the proceedings at any moment. And he watched Marian, positioned near the kitchen entrance with the other serving staff, her expression carrying a quiet worry she could not quite hide, clearly still puzzling over his cryptic words from the previous evening. The final course arrived, and Barnaby, following the careful plan they had arranged together, rose from his position near the head of the table and addressed the gathered guests with practiced formality. "Ladies and gentlemen," the old steward announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed dining hall, "I am pleased to inform you that the Duke of this estate has, in fact, already returned among us, and wishes now to address this gathering directly, regarding certain matters of considerable importance to this household's future." A ripple of confused murmuring passed through the assembled guests. Vivienne's gracious smile faltered slightly, uncertain what this unexpected announcement might mean. Edmund's face went pale, his hand tightening visibly around his wine glass. Alden stepped forward from his position near the serving table, and with deliberate, unhurried movements, removed the footman's coat he had worn for weeks, revealing beneath it the finely tailored clothing of his true station, clothing Barnaby had secretly delivered days earlier and hidden precisely for this moment. Gasps erupted throughout the dining hall as recognition dawned across the assembled faces. Vivienne rose halfway from her seat, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, disbelief, and something that looked distinctly like panic. Edmund's wine glass slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the polished floor in an echo of the very accident that had revealed Vivienne's true cruelty weeks earlier. "Alden," Vivienne breathed, her voice barely audible in the stunned silence, "you have been here this entire time, as a footman." "As Tom, yes," Alden confirmed, his voice carrying the quiet authority of his true title now, entirely unlike the careful deference he had maintained throughout his weeks of disguise. "I returned weeks ago, and rather than announce myself immediately, I chose to observe this household as an ordinary servant to understand truly, without the distortion my title and fortune inevitably create, exactly who around me could be trusted and who could not." He turned his gaze toward Edmund, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "I have documentation, cousin, thoroughly prepared by my own solicitor in London, detailing your careful arrangements with our family solicitor to claim this estate should I fail to return within a specific window of time. Documentation that makes quite clear you were not simply preparing for an unfortunate possibility, but actively working to ensure that possibility became reality, regardless of my actual well-being." "Alden, I can explain," Edmund began, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "You may explain whatever you wish," Alden said, his voice cold and final, "to the solicitors who will now review your conduct with considerably more scrutiny than they previously applied. But you will do so after you have vacated this house, effective immediately, and I would strongly advise against attempting to contest the documentation I now possess." The dining hall remained utterly silent as Edmund rose from his seat, his composure entirely shattered, and departed the room without another word, several guests watching his exit with expressions of scandalized fascination that would undoubtedly fuel county gossip for months to come. Alden turned his attention next toward Vivienne, who had remained frozen in her half-risen position throughout the entire confrontation, her expression a careful mask struggling to conceal the calculation churning visibly beneath it. "Alden, my darling," she began, her voice recovering some of its practiced warmth, "I am simply overjoyed to see you returned safely and in such evidently good health and fortune. Whatever rumors circulated during your absence I never once doubted." "Please," Alden interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced her immediately. "I have spent these past weeks reading your letters to your mother, Vivienne. I know of the settlements you inquired about with Viscount Pelham. I know of your careful calculations regarding my supposedly diminished fortune. And I witnessed, personally, the manner in which you spoke to a servant you believed beneath your notice, revealing precisely the character that lies beneath the gracious warmth you display so easily before company." Vivienne's face went white, then flushed with something between shame and anger. "You were spying on me," she said, her voice tight with outrage. "Reading my private correspondence, disguising yourself to test my loyalty as though I were some criminal requiring investigation." "I was testing whether the woman I intended to marry loved me, or merely loved my title and fortune," Alden replied evenly. "I believe the answer has become entirely clear to everyone present this evening." Vivienne opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently recognizing at last that no clever words would repair the damage her own actions had already caused before this entire gathering of witnesses. She gathered what remained of her dignity, rose fully from her seat, and departed the dining hall without another word, her carefully constructed composure finally, completely abandoned. The remaining guests sat in stunned, fascinated silence, uncertain how to respond to the extraordinary revelations they had just witnessed. Alden allowed himself a long moment to simply breathe, the weight of weeks of careful deception finally, fully lifted from his shoulders. Then his gaze found Marian, still standing near the kitchen entrance, her expression caught somewhere between shock and dawning understanding as she processed exactly who the footman she had befriended, and perhaps grown to care for, truly was. Alden crossed the dining hall, ignoring the murmuring guests who watched his every movement with undisguised fascination, and made his way directly toward the kitchen entrance where Marian stood frozen, her hands still clutching the serving cloth she had been holding when the revelation unfolded. "Marian," he said quietly, stopping before her, suddenly uncertain despite everything he had planned to say in this exact moment. "I owe you an explanation and an apology for the deception I maintained throughout our entire acquaintance." Marian stared at him, her expression cycling through emotions too quickly for him to fully read. "You are the Duke," she said slowly, as though testing the words for the first time. "You have been the Duke this entire time. Every conversation we shared, every evening by the kitchen fire, you were never truly Tom the footman at all." "I was Tom," Alden said gently. "Every word I spoke to you during those evenings was honest, Marian, regardless of the false name attached to it. The thoughts I shared, the concerns I confided, the growing fondness I felt for your company, none of that was a performance. Only the circumstances surrounding it were disguised." "Why?" Marian asked, and Alden heard genuine hurt beneath the question, hurt he had feared but had not fully prepared himself to witness so directly. "Why deceive an entire household, deceive me for weeks on end, when you could have simply returned and observed us honestly as yourself?" "Because I needed to know," Alden said, "whether the people around me valued my character or merely my title and fortune. I had heard rumors before I ever returned that my finances might be ruined, and I feared, given those rumors, that I would never truly know who around me could be trusted if I returned openly, wrapped once again in the protection my position provides. As a footman, I was invisible enough to witness the truth directly, without the distortion that title and wealth inevitably create in how people treat you." Marian absorbed this explanation slowly, her expression still guarded but gradually softening as she considered his words. "And what did you learn," she asked finally, "during these weeks of careful observation?" "I learned that my betrothed valued settlements and security considerably more than she valued affection for the man she claimed to love," Alden said. "I learned that my own cousin was actively scheming to claim my inheritance, regardless of my actual well-being. And I learned," he continued, his voice softening further, "that a kitchen maid with rough hands and an honest heart offered me more genuine kindness during these difficult weeks than anyone else within this entire household, without ever once knowing there was a title or fortune attached to the man she was being kind toward." Marian's eyes widened slightly, understanding beginning to dawn across her features. "Tom, or Alden, or whatever name I should properly call you now," she said, her voice uncertain, "I do not know what to make of any of this. You are a duke, I am a kitchen maid. Whatever fondness grew between us during these past weeks existed within a lie, however honestly you claim your words were meant." "The lie was only my name and my circumstances," Alden said, stepping closer, his voice earnest and steady despite the vulnerability of the moment. "Everything else, every conversation, every quiet evening, every moment I found myself drawn toward your company rather than my duties, that was entirely true. I did not plan to feel what I feel for you, Marian. I expected, when I began this disguise, to simply observe and gather information before returning to my proper life and my proper betrothal. I did not expect to find, in the middle of my own kitchen, a woman whose character and honesty surpassed everything I had once believed I wanted in a wife." The dining hall had grown quiet behind them, several guests clearly straining to overhear this remarkable conversation unfolding near the kitchen entrance, though Alden found he no longer cared what any of them thought or witnessed. "You cannot possibly mean to suggest," Marian said, her voice barely above a whisper now, "that a duke intends to court a kitchen maid. Such things do not happen, Alden. Not in the world either of us actually lives within." "Perhaps such things do not happen often," Alden acknowledged, "but I have never much cared for doing only what is expected of me, particularly not after these past weeks taught me exactly how little the expectations of my station have ever guaranteed genuine happiness or loyalty. I'm not asking you to become a duchess overnight, Marian, nor am I asking you to answer this question immediately, surrounded by an audience neither of us invited into this conversation. I am simply asking whether you might be willing, given time, to discover whether what grew between us these past weeks could become something more, now that you know the truth of who I actually am." Marian studied him for a long, silent moment, the kitchen cloth still clutched tightly in her hands, her expression a careful mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty. "You truly meant everything you said to me," she asked quietly, "during all those evenings by the fire? The dreams you shared, the fears you confided, none of that was calculated to win my favor for whatever test you were conducting?" "None of it," Alden confirmed. "I did not even fully understand, until recently, how deeply I had come to care for your company, Marian. It crept upon me slowly, through honest conversation rather than any calculated design, until I found myself, more evenings than I could count, inventing excuses simply to remain near you a little longer. A small, uncertain smile finally broke across Marian's face, and Alden felt something in his chest loosen with relief at the sight of it. "I confess," she admitted, "that I found myself doing much the same, wondering why a simple footman occupied so much of my thoughts during these past weeks, when I had never allowed myself such foolishness before." "Then perhaps," Alden said, allowing himself hope for the first time since this entire remarkable evening began, "we might discover together, without the pressure of titles or expectations weighing too heavily upon it, whether that foolishness might grow into something lasting." The gathered guests, no longer even pretending disinterest in the remarkable scene unfolding before them, watched as the Duke of Whitmore extended his hand toward a kitchen maid in the middle of his own dining hall, an act so thoroughly outside the expectations of their world that several guests would spend years afterward recounting the story to anyone willing to listen. Marian hesitated only a moment before setting down her serving cloth and taking his offered hand, her fingers rough against his own smoother palm, a contrast that had once separated their worlds so completely and now, somehow, felt like exactly the right fit. In the weeks that followed, the household adjusted slowly to the extraordinary changes that single dinner had set into motion. Edmund departed the estate entirely, his fraudulent scheme thoroughly exposed, and his reputation among the county's families irreparably damaged, though Alden, in a moment of grace he later credited entirely to Marian's gentle influence, declined to pursue formal legal punishment beyond ensuring his cousin could never again attempt such deception. Vivienne, for her part, married Viscount Pelham within the year, a match that surprised absolutely no one who had witnessed her behavior during the preceding months, and the two settled into a marriage that county gossip described, with barely concealed amusement, as perfectly suited to both parties' practical natures. Marian remained hesitant at first to fully accept the transformation her life was undergoing, uncertain how to navigate a world of titles and formal expectations so foreign to everything she had known growing up in her father's modest household. But Alden proved patient, courting her gently over the following months with a sincerity that gradually eroded whatever doubts remained about whether their unlikely match could truly succeed. He introduced her slowly to the responsibilities that would eventually accompany her new position, never once making her feel inadequate for lacking the formal education or refined manners that typically accompanied a duchess's upbringing, and found, more often than not, that her honest instincts about people and situations proved wiser than any formal training could have provided. Barnaby, watching the courtship unfold with quiet satisfaction, remarked once to Alden that he had never seen his master appear so genuinely content, not even during the years before his departure abroad when his engagement to Vivienne had seemed, to outside observers, like the perfect match between two well-suited families. "Contentment built on honesty tends to outlast contentment built on appearance," Alden replied, watching Marian across the garden where she was teaching one of the younger kitchen maids a particular technique for preserving summer vegetables through the coming winter, her patient warmth extending as naturally to others as it had once extended to a lonely footman she had no reason to trust beyond his own honest character. "I spent years believing my happiness depended on securing the proper match, the proper connections, the proper appearance of a successful dukedom. I did not understand, until I disguised myself and lost all of that temporarily, exactly how little any of it mattered compared to finding someone who valued me for reasons that had nothing to do with my title at all." The wedding, when it finally occurred the following spring, was a considerably smaller affair than the grand society event Vivienne had once anticipated for herself, held in the estate's modest chapel rather than a fashionable London cathedral, attended more by household staff and genuine friends than by the calculating society figures who had once populated Vivienne's careful guest lists. Marian wore a simple gown of her own choosing rather than the elaborate fashion Vivienne would have insisted upon, and Alden found, watching her walk toward him through the small gathering of witnesses, that he had never felt more certain of any decision in his entire life. Their marriage in the years that followed became something of a quiet legend throughout the county, whispered about with a mixture of scandal and admiration by families who had known Alden's father and grandfather, dukes who had married strictly within their own social station according to careful arrangement rather than genuine affection. Marian never fully abandoned the practical, grounded wisdom of her upbringing, insisting on maintaining a modest garden of her own despite the grand estate now surrounding her, continuing to visit the kitchen regularly not as its mistress issuing commands, but as a friend checking on people she had once worked alongside as an equal. And Alden, reflecting often on the strange weeks he had spent disguised as a humble footman within his own household, understood that the entire elaborate test, however uncomfortable and risky it had proven, had given him something considerably more valuable than the answers he originally sought. It had given him the clarity to recognize genuine love when he finally encountered it, unclouded by the distortions his title and fortune had always previously created, and had led him, however circuitously, toward a happiness he had never fully believed possible before that fateful night he stepped down from his carriage in a borrowed coat, uncertain what truths awaited him within his own home. The kitchen maid who had once worried for a stranger's suffering without any expectation of reward or recognition had become his duchess, and their household in the years that followed remained known throughout the county not for its grand displays of wealth or fashionable connections, but for something considerably rarer among families of their station. A marriage built entirely on honest affection, tested and proven true long before either party ever fully understood what was truly at stake. 2 years into their marriage, a new challenge arrived at the estate, one neither Alden nor Marian had fully anticipated despite the quiet peace they had come to expect from their unconventional match. A distant relation of the Whitmore family, a stern-faced barrister named Cornelius Hartwell, arrived unannounced one autumn afternoon carrying documents he claimed proved the marriage between a duke and a former kitchen maid violated an obscure clause within an ancient family trust, one that required the Whitmore title to pass only through marriages conducted between individuals of established noble lineage on both sides. Alden received the man in his study with careful courtesy, though Marian, seated beside him despite Hartwell's obvious discomfort at her presence during matters of legal importance, refused to be dismissed from a conversation directly concerning her own standing within the family she had joined. "This clause you speak of," Alden said, examining the documents Hartwell had presented with growing skepticism, "has never once been invoked in the 200 years since it was supposedly written into our family trust. I find it curious that it should surface now, so conveniently timed, barely 2 years after my own marriage." "The clause exists regardless of whether it has been previously invoked, Your Grace," Hartwell replied stiffly, "and I have been retained by certain parties concerned about the legitimacy of the succession, given the unconventional circumstances of your marriage, to ensure the family's ancient traditions are properly upheld." "Certain parties," Marian repeated quietly, her voice carrying a sharpness Alden had rarely heard from her. "Would these certain parties happen to include a gentleman named Edmund Carow, by any chance? A man who once schemed to claim this very estate through fraudulent means, and who might understandably harbor considerable resentment toward the marriage that ultimately secured my husband's happiness beyond his reach entirely." Hartwell's composure flickered, just slightly, confirming Marian's suspicion before he could offer any denial. "I am not at liberty to disclose the identity of my clients, madam." "You need not disclose it," Alden said coldly, rising from his desk. "The timing alone tells us everything necessary. My cousin, having failed once to claim this estate through fraud, now attempts a second scheme through obscure legal technicality, hoping perhaps that a court unfamiliar with the true circumstances might rule in his favor out of simple deference to tradition." He spent the following weeks consulting his own solicitors, gathering historical records proving that similar clauses within comparable family trusts throughout the county had been repeatedly overturned by courts unwilling to enforce restrictions so clearly outdated and discriminatory against marriages built on genuine affection rather than calculated lineage. Marian, rather than retreating from the challenge as Hartwell had perhaps expected, threw herself into the preparation with the same steady determination she had once brought to running a demanding kitchen, reviewing documents late into the evening alongside her husband, and offering insights about the practical realities of estate management that even Alden's most experienced solicitors had occasionally overlooked. "You need not involve yourself so deeply in these legal matters," Alden said one evening, watching her pore over a stack of historical precedents with fierce concentration. "I do not wish this challenge to burden you unnecessarily." "It is not a burden," Marian replied without looking up from her reading. "It is my life they are attempting to unravel, Alden, my marriage and my place within this family. I have no intention of sitting quietly aside while others decide my fate on my behalf, particularly not when the man orchestrating this entire scheme has already proven himself willing to deceive an entire household for personal gain. Her determination proved well-founded. When the matter finally reached formal review before the county's ecclesiastical court, the presiding judge, after reviewing both the historical precedents Alden's solicitors had gathered and the obvious personal grievance motivating Hartwell's clients, dismissed the challenge entirely, ruling firmly that no marriage conducted honestly and legally between consenting adults could be unraveled based on an archaic clause never previously enforced in 2 centuries of the family's history. Edmund's involvement, confirmed beyond doubt through careful investigation during the proceedings, resulted in consequences considerably more severe than the mild consequences Alden had originally allowed him following his first scheme. The second attempt, motivated so transparently by bitter resentment rather than any genuine legal concern, convinced Alden that his cousin's capacity for scheming would never fully cease so long as any opportunity remained available to him. He ensured through careful legal arrangement that Edmund would have no further claim or connection to the Whitmore estate whatsoever, a final severance that closed the door permanently on the ambitions that had once threatened everything Alden held dear. The victory, when it finally arrived, brought Alden and Marian closer together than perhaps any other challenge they had faced during their marriage, having weathered together not merely the ordinary difficulties of adjusting to their unconventional union, but a direct legal assault on the very legitimacy of their love. Marian, in the aftermath, found herself viewed with newfound respect throughout the county, no longer simply the curious kitchen maid who had somehow captured a duke's affection, but a woman who had demonstrated, through her own determined intelligence and quiet strength, exactly why that affection had proven so well placed from the very beginning. Their household grew over the following years to include 2 children, a daughter with her mother's steady warmth and a son with his father's careful thoughtfulness, both raised with an unusual awareness, for children of their station, that character mattered considerably more than title or fortune in determining a person's true worth. Marian insisted, despite the objections of more traditional relations, that both children spend time in the kitchen and gardens alongside the household staff, learning practical skills and genuine humility rather than growing up believing their birth alone entitled them to respect they had not yet earned. Alden, watching his children grow within a household built on principles he had only discovered through his own desperate weeks of disguise years earlier, often reflected on how differently his life might have unfolded had he never made that fateful decision to return home unrecognized. He might have married Vivienne, might have discovered her true nature only after vows had already bound them together, might have spent decades trapped within a marriage built on calculated appearance rather than genuine affection. Instead, through a test born of fear and uncertainty, he had discovered something considerably more valuable than he had ever anticipated finding. Marian, for her part, never fully lost the practical humility that had first drawn Alden's attention during those quiet evenings by the kitchen fire. She continued, even as Duchess, to maintain her own small garden, to check regularly on the well-being of household staff regardless of their station, and to offer the same steady kindness to strangers that had once made her worry so genuinely for a duke she believed she would never meet. Years later, when their daughter, grown into a thoughtful young woman herself, asked how her parents had first met, Alden and Marian would often exchange a knowing glance before offering the story together, each adding details the other had forgotten or emphasized differently, weaving together an account that had become, over the decades, something close to legend within their own family. A duke disguised as a humble footman, testing the loyalty of those closest to him, only to discover genuine love in the last place he expected to find it, offered freely by a woman who valued his character long before she ever learned his true name. It remained, throughout their long and contented marriage, the story they told most often, and the one that never once grew tiresome in the retelling, precisely because it had taught them both, in the most direct way possible, exactly what love built on honesty could withstand when tested against every pressure the world attempted to place upon it.